Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.
Hello, I'm Lorene Mills, and welcome to Report from Santa Fe. We have a special guest today, one of my favorite New Mexico authors, David Morrell.
Hi.
Thank you for joining us.
Oh, I'm happy to be here. We've been doing this a little bit for a couple of years, and it's always a joy to come back and continue the conversation.
I will say it's more than a joy. It's actually a big thrill.
Oh.
Because what I found is you on the cover of The Big Thrill. I mean, really, to be the cover of a magazine called The Big Thrill. Tell me about this cover.
Well, it's an organization called the International Thriller Writers, and there once a month they put out the magazine, and you can see that there were a lot of other thriller authors on there, but for somebody who writes thrillers and mysteries to have to have my face on that is pretty overwhelming.
I thought it was absolutely delightful. You're a Canadian-American novelist. You're best known, you've burst onto fame with your 1972 debut novel, First Blood, which became Rambo and the Rambo industry, practically.
With Sylvester Stallone. There were 4 films eventually made with the character, and you know, the book was published in '72, which means that we're filming this in November of 2016. Next year is the 45th anniversary of the book. It's never been out of print. It's been quite a ride. But the film was made 10 years afterward. It took 10 years. Steve McQueen was going to be Rambo at one time, but Steve was at that time around 45 years old, and Vietnam was a young person's war, and in '75 when they thought about making it with him, there was no way he would have been believable, even though he had a chance to do the wonderful motorcycle stuff.
Yeah. Well, because of this and other works, you've been called the father of the modern action novel, and you set out to do something very different. Tell me about your relationship to Hemingway and what you noticed in Hemingway's war and action novels.
Yes, I was a professor. I was a graduate student at Penn State in American literature. And I had gone there specifically to study Hemingway with a well-known Hemingway scholar named Philip Young. I wanted to be a writer. Since I was 17, there's a classic TV series called Route 66. And writing for that, a man named Sterling Silliphant had inspired me to want to be a writer. So I'd always wanted to do it, but I figured I'd probably need a day job too. So there I was at Penn State in 1968. And I had an epiphany about Hemingway, which is that while he's an artistic writer, he's also an action writer. For Whom the Bell Tolls, A Farewell to Arms, To Have and Have Not. It's a lot of action books. And I was studying him, and it occurred to me that he had written action as if it had never been written about before. None of the pop cliches such as a gunshot rang out or gun smoke filled the air, that kind of thing. And it was as if he had invented how to write action. And I had, the epiphany I had was, what if I could try to write an action book that did not feel like a genre book? And I worked on it for 3 years. It was a little unclear whether or not there was a market for it, but the book sold almost immediately to a publisher. And one of those wild things that happens to a first novel, it got reviewed everywhere. So the approach that I used to try to find new ways to write about action is why I've been called the father of the modern action novel.
Because you changed the action genre by taking out all the pulp cliches that people expected. And talk about action. The standard action movie has 5 action scenes in it. Rambo is 96 minutes long. 53 minutes of it are action.
It's very weird. If you look at movies from the 60s and 70s, hit action movies, let's use the James Bond novel as an example, usually they would have 5 major action scenes with filler between. Or if I'm talking about Steve McQueen, who fascinates me. Bullet, a widely recognized action film, has the car chase, it has the gunfight at San Francisco Airport, it has an earlier chase through a hospital, but that's pretty much it. Most of it's procedural, but at the time this was considered state of the art. And with what happened with First Blood is because it's one continuous action scene, so that when they made the film, which is 96 minutes long, that they discovered for promotional purposes to the American film market for overseas distributors. So they said, oh, let's condense it. How much action have we got? They discovered they had like 55 minutes or something of nonstop action out of 96 minutes, which includes the credits. So it changed the way movies were made. And the next one after that was Die Hard, which built on it. In fact, in Die Hard, somebody asked Bruce Willis, "Who do you think you are, Rambo?" So you can sometimes trace this in the 80s.
Well, it was one of the most influential and most watched movies, even politically. Now, you say that the book had a longer life because you kept the immediate politics of the time out of it. But in Berlin and Poland, tell me about how Rambo was in 1985, for example.
I love to tell the story. I was in, to back up, as you mentioned, I'm Canadian. I'm now an American citizen, but at the time I was Canadian, and a condition of my card, my student card, was that, hey, this isn't your country, and these are volatile times to do with Vietnam. You might have political opinions, keep them to yourself. So I always felt like I was a fly on the wall, and I wanted to say things, but I didn't have the legal right to say it. And this tipped over into the novel, which is about Vietnam, but I think if I mention Vietnam twice in the whole thing, I might not even have done that. The novel reads, it doesn't date. You read it today and it feels like it was written yesterday because it doesn't have any time stamps to it. So, all right, jumping ahead. I was in Poland in 2001 on a publicity tour. And it was a little surprising to me because the journalists were lined up for 3 days of interviews every half hour for 3 days. And I'm thinking, this doesn't feel right. This is, something's not right. And a journalist, a woman of about 35, spoke English very well, said, you're having trouble understanding this? And I said, yes. She said, you have to understand that in the late 80s and early 90s, the Rambo films were against the law in Poland, but we smuggled them in and watched them dressed up as Rambo and then went out to demonstrate against the Soviet troops. So she said, in a small way, you could say that Rambo helped bring down the USSR. So, you got to laugh at this, but I remember when the Berlin Wall went down on national television, somebody had written Rambo on it as it was being torn down.
Yeah,
so,
too bad you didn't get that piece of the wall.
I don't. Yeah, it was a big piece of the wall, so I don't know where I would have put it.
So, as father of modern action novel, you've gotten the Thriller Master Lifetime Achievement Awards. You've been nominated and received most of the Thriller Awards, Edgar, Nero, Anthony. 30 novels, maybe more, 26 languages, and maybe 30 million copies in print?
At the last time I looked, it was 18 million in 30 languages, and I have to be very careful here. I do not have an Edgar. I had an Edgar nomination.
Yes.
Okay. But I've been very blessed in terms of people recognizing what I do.
Yes, but what you do is, you have said that what we are doing is writing the fictional autobiography of our souls.
Yeah.
That's how you describe your work.
Well, it goes back to what I was saying about trying to write action books or thrillers or mysteries. It didn't feel like genre books. So if somebody reads my work in chronological order, it'll be very clear what was going on in my mind and my emotions. The early books tend to be about young men looking for dependable father figures and not finding them.
And how does that reflect your own life?
My father died in combat. My mother, at a time when there were a few social services, did her best to take care of me and work. She was a seamstress. and couldn't do it, and so she put me in an orphanage for a time, and then she remarried, but the man she married, the second man, didn't like children. And there were massive fights, and I used to sleep under my bed out of fear, telling stories to myself in the dark. And so this need to have a positive role model stayed with me, and in a sense, First Blood with the older policeman. It's not like the movie where they might be brothers. This is a father figure and a rebellious son, as it were. And that went on for quite a while in a book called The Brotherhood of the Rose. Two orphans, imagine that, are befriended by an elderly man who works for the CIA and is looking for private spies who will do anything for them because of love. And he basically corrupts them, and they find out that, essentially they were set up to be betrayed, and that older man, it was my stepfather in my mind. So then my son, God bless him, Matthew, died when he was 15 in 1987. And the stories changed, and now you had fathers, as it were, father figures looking for son figures whom they could depend upon. And we went on and on and on, and in 2009, my granddaughter, Natalie, 14 years old, died from the same rare bone cancer that killed my son. And I was overwhelmed by that, and in fact, the motive for my recent books, 3 Victorian mystery thrillers, was that my double grief, as it were, had so weighed. I mean, it wasn't good. That I just needed to get away into a world that I could control, and I fell in love with the Victorian-era in the 1850s London, and so for 7 years I in my mind lived there as an escape from the grief that I was feeling. So these are highlights of over many decades, but if you looked at it in chronological order, you would say, I get it, I see what's going on. You might not know the impetus for the emotions, but you would know that the emotions had changed.
When there was a shift in the fictional autobiography. Well, I've asked you here because we are celebrating the third in your trilogy of Victorian thriller murder mysteries with the amazing Thomas De Quincey, a real literary figure, as the detective.
Yes.
I mean, this is an extraordinary creation. So I just want to show this is the third.
It's a great cover,
I can't
isn't it,
say
with the train
best.
on it?
I just love it. I just love it. This is called Ruler of the Night. It's a third, but let's go back. You start with this one, Murder is a Fine Art, and what is the title from?
Thomas De Quincey, who was a real person of the period and was known as the opium eater because he had been the first person to write about drug addiction in a famous book called Confessions of an English Opium Eater. And he had, because of his opium nightmares, constructed a theory about the human mind, which feels so much like Freud, but it was 70 years ahead of Freud, in which he said that the human mind was composed of chasms and sunless abysses, layer upon layer, in which there are secret chambers where alien natures can hide undetected.
Coleridge, Xanadu did Kubla Khan, down to a sunless sea. I mean, didn't he invent the word unconscious or subconscious?
De Quincey invented the word subconscious and truly anticipated Freud and the whole analysis of dreams. And so I had this notion, it still makes me smile, that Scotland Yard's detective division had only been created, this is in 1854-55, had only been created back in 1842, very recent, and they were happy to have modern crime-fighting tools such as plaster casts of footprints.
Right.
And along comes Thomas De Quincey. In my novel, they didn't work together in real life, talking to them about the chasms and sunless abysses of the human mind, and what are they going to do with this guy who's also an opium addict? So I just had, it was delightful to bring that together, and the extra in the mix is that he was fascinated by mass murderers and had written a famous series of essays called On Murder Considered as One of the Fine Arts. which is where the title Murder
Yes.
is a Fine Art comes from. And he had, each of the three books has a major Victorian crime that changed the culture. And the Murder is a Fine Art's about the first mass media murders, publicity-driven murders. Back in 1811 with a newspaper, there were 52 newspapers, and they were able to get transported via mail coaches throughout England in a couple of days, which is lightning speed. And so he was so fascinated by this as a young man that in later years he recreated the murders in one of the essays inventing the true crime genre, and I thought this is too good. So the notion of the first novel was that his essay recreating them was published, and that's real, and that somebody would use it as a blueprint to recreate the murders in actuality, and that he would be forced to work with Scotland Yard. So I mean, great fun and lots of history.
But what else is real is that he influenced Poe.
Yes.
Author Conan Doyle. We got Sherlock Holmes out of that.
Yes.
Can you walk us back through the chain of true crime genre?
Edgar Allan Poe adored Thomas De Quincey, and he used a lot of De Quincey's techniques in his own work, particularly something like The Fall of the House of Ussr. So the time came when Poe, having studied De Quincey, worked out the first detective story called The Murders in the Rue Morgue. There were two others that he wrote as well. And in it, he invented the eccentric detective with the worshiping sidekick who wrote down the adventures. And what happened with Conan Doyle is and Conan Doyle admitted it. It's not like it's a shock. He lifted wholesale the formula that Poe had worked out and did with Sherlock Holmes and Watson. So, but if you go this way, the drug addiction and all that you can see in Poe's work, and then comes through into Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes is a drug addict. So where is this going? This is going back to De Quincey. And in one of the stories, De Quincey is even mentioned and referred to, and, as if everybody would know about him.
We're speaking today with David Morrell about these wonderful trilogy of historical thrillers starring Thomas De Quincey, the English author, who wrote Confessions of an English Opium Eater. But he transcends his role in history. Even Jorge Luis Borges says De Quincey lives on in memory like a character in fiction rather than a reality. And look what you did.
When I started reading, I heard about De Quincey accidentally, and the implication was that he'd anticipated Freud, and I said, well, if he did, I want to learn about this. And as I mentioned, this thought came to me shortly after my granddaughter died, and I became mesmerized by this man who was so unique and whose place in literary history had been denied to him. He's a brilliant author, but denied to him because of the drug stuff.
The prejudice against the drugs.
But whether he was brilliant and the drugs held him back a little, but he was still brilliant, or whether he was brilliant because of the drugs, no one will ever know. But this guy, he invented new forms of literary criticism. As I said, he invented the true crime genre. He was early a writer of a type of fiction called the sensation novel, which eventually morphed into what we call thrillers. Literally, it's major influence. And I honestly fell in love with the guy, and it was so much fun to do these three books. And as I said, each of them. The first one was about the Radcliffe Highway murders. These sensational. They changed. They paralyzed.
That's Murder is a Fine Art. The first one.
And then in the next one, Inspector the Dead, the true crimes were the numerous attempts to assassinate Queen Victoria. There were 8 attempts to kill her, and one guy tried to do it twice. So there were 7 guys and 8 attempts. Yeah. He tried to do it 2 days in a row, and then in the third one, it's the first murder on an English train.
So this comes out this week.
It comes out on November 15th.
Ruler of the Night. It's the third in the trilogy, and you said that coming out of writing these 3 books was like coming out of a bathysphere.
It was
7 years.
Long times. For several of those years, I only read books. I read the grammar in that sentence is awful. I read only those books which were related to 1850s London or the sensation novel or Thomas De Quincey, or I gave myself, as it were, a privately earned PhD in American culture. And just to give one example, I was talking about the book Spectre of the Dead, about the attempts against Queen Victoria. I've read books and books and books about her, and you don't want to overdo the details, but how could I find a detail that would perfectly summarize her history and the way she was? And I seized upon the fact that her mother, being very ambitious for her, when Victoria was very small, insisted on putting a sprig of holly under her
prickly holly.
Prickly holly. It's brittle, sharp, painful, stinging, and it was put under her collar, the child's collar, in such a way that if Victoria stood very straight, it would not hurt her. So she had that posture for the rest of her life, and then for Ruler of the Night, which, as I mentioned, is about the first murder on an English train. I've quickly realized that, historically, the real first murder, I quickly realized how different trains were back there. I love to, if we have a moment, I'd just love to talk about, there were no corridors in cars. The English call them carriages, we call them cars, so that the carriages were divided into small compartments capable of holding 8 people, 4 facing this way, 4 facing that way, a door there, a door there. And when the train was about to pull out of the station, the guard locked the doors. And the windows were barred. In effect, these people were in cells. Why? Because there was a fear that people would open the door or lean out a window and get brained by a passing post or what have you. Regardless, once that train started, you were a prisoner. And literally this happened. That was the inspiration for Ruler of the Night. A banker got into the car. No one else there. It was like 8 o'clock at night. Another guy got in the car. Guard locked the door. Train pulled out, and a second guy pulled out a knife. And it wouldn't matter how much you screamed. No one could help you.
Yeah.
And this traumatized English society. I mean, it was unthinkable that such a thing would happen, and it traumatized English society the way the other crimes in the other novels had. I just loved it. Can you imagine being in those cramped compartments and not knowing whether the person next to you was going to attack you or not, and that you'd be helpless?
And you not only talk about the trains themselves, but how rapidly the railroad crisscrossed Great Britain. I mean, it was just like it went from the old mail coaches, of which De Quincey waxes nostalgic, because they're upset about how fast everything got, and I mean, there's so much about these books. One of the other things you do, it has to do with form and content. You use some of the devices of Victorian fiction, the journal entries from Emily, the daughter.
Who is a version of my deceased granddaughter. Again, talking about that autobiography of our souls. A bookseller, Barbara Peters, a friend of mine, said to me, Emily, who was real, but she says, you're making her like your granddaughter. And I thought, oh, wow. And that may have accounted, too, for the way I absorbed myself into the books.
So you paint a wonderful picture of hydropathy, taking the water as a water cure.
The water cures. The 1850s were in England. You went to these places where they wrapped you up in sheets, in wet sheets, and wrapped you and wrapped you and wrapped you and wrapped you and set you on a table, and then put more wet sheets on top of you, and we're going to leave you there for hours and hours and hours. Now, what happened? It's like a self-contained steam bath or a sweat bath, and you'd get a fever. I mean, you're sweating and sweating. It's a wonder people didn't die with this. And there's a great scene in that I found it very amusing where in the height of De Quincey trying to clear his drug addiction, they wrapped him up like this, and he's soaked and he's sweating and he's delirious, and suddenly they realize that the building's on fire. They got to get out of here pretty fast, and the daughter is unrolling him like this, and he's thumping along, and as they're thumping, they're talking about how they figured out who the bad guy is. Lots of fun.
Well, these books are just a remarkable accomplishment. I want to thank you. I turned off the election news. I curled up and read Ruler of the Night and just loved it, as I've read all of them.
My goal was to make people truly feel they were there.
Yes, I was surprised that it was New Mexico when I emerged. But what is the next step? We've looked at your work as the fictional autobiography of your soul. Do you know what the next step will be, or are you just going to come out from the bathysphere of Victorian England and see what comes?
I'm in with Victorian withdrawal. It's almost like, it was writing these novels was like a drug, and it was truly shocking to finish the book, the last one, and because I knew there would only be 3, and to come up, as it were, and look around and be. There's a film that Christopher Reeve was in called Somewhere in Time, based upon a Richard Matheson novel, Bid Time Return, and he hypnotizes himself into thinking he's back at the turn of the century, and something goes wrong. He's got a coin in his pocket that shouldn't be there, and it snaps him, and all of a sudden he's in the present again. And